coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Look at those images today, right? I mean, am I nuts? Like, you look at the images, it's like, wait a minute, America, blah, 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 and the peaceful transition of power in a militarized city where there's no citizens and only elites? This is insane. Like, even visually, it's done. Like, those images are done. And I think the worry is that we have to be watchful and take action and move forward and build the things we need to build right now, because what they're doing is creating a radically unstable situation where the language everyone speaks, the fantasy they project, all of this has nothing to do with reality. That's a really dangerous place to be as a country.
Welcome, everyone, once again, to the Roundtable, the Publishers and Editors podcast here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books. I'm joined by Matthew Peterson, vice president of education and founding editor of the American Mind, who's staring oddly into his bullet-pierced whiskey glass. You got a bug in there?
I think there's impurities in my whiskey.
Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books, David Barr, Senior Director of Communications, and James Pullis, Executive Editor of the American Mind. Well, it's Inauguration Day, gents. That was a stirring, moving speech, deftly delivered. It profoundly changed my view of, it was, I don't know, I would say it's probably a mediocre inaugural speech. It's not horrible. But it's not very good either. And it was delivered sort of tepidly, as we expect from Biden these days. Just a couple slip-ups, but without too much energy. And in an odd scene, thousands of troops surrounding him on the dais. And as our friend Rachel Bovard tweeted when she tweeted alongside a picture of Nancy Pelosi kind of with one arm draped over George W. Bush pointing towards the camera, and then Michelle and Barack in the foreground, and everyone kind of laughing. Big uniparty energy is what Rachel said. So we wanted to talk a bit about this today, and then talk about the 1776 report, and then talk a little bit about 1 year at the American Mind. Is it our 52nd episode, Jake?
53rd, 52 was last week.
53rd, so we've been doing this for a year, week in and week out. Some of us have skipped weeks, but because Spencer is always vigilant, we've actually done a full year's worth of weekly podcasts.
We'll never depart from this recording studio. Even when I'm physically absent from it, I am present in spirit, recording endlessly.
No, I mean, what to say about the inaugural? I mean, if you just took it on its face, it would have been what I think mostly what Biden wanted it to be. But if you take the varying interpretations of the words used in this speech by the leading factions, ideological and political in this country, it takes on very different meanings for both sides. And I think that's probably, that was true with Obama as well. Obama was a pretty deft appropriator of the language of the founding and even of conservatives when it suited his purposes, much more deft than I think Biden is. But yeah.
Can I say before everyone gets into the words, just get a precursor out there. I mean, I really think I feel very strongly, as someone else would say. I don't think this speech mattered. I think the idea is that these words are going to matter a lot, and this is the most important speech, as people are saying, since Lincoln's inaugural. And I think the opposite is true. I don't think the words really matter today at all. And if the medium is the message, the medium was the imagery of today, which will resonate in the American psyche for a long time. And that imagery was a doddering old man surrounded by a small group of elites who we're all sick of, who we've seen for years, who rule their roost, surrounded by a militarized capital with 26,000 National Guardsmen and with a bunch of flags, just quivering in the wind, in the cold wind, that are supposed to represent the American people, who, by the way, were not there. And the whole thing ends, as opposed to the riot that we must all condemn and deplore that shook the foundations of democracy. It ends with people taking selfies, but now it's only the elites without any of the people anywhere nearby, anywhere to be seen, taking selfies of each other and superficial pop stars as they congratulate one another and give a vision, as Ryan just said, of the uniparty. I mean, I don't think there's any better way to end the last 4 years than that. Congrats, guys. You succeeded. And you succeeded in doing it on national television. And, what we say here will not long be remembered, Joe Biden. But what will be remembered is that imagery in front of the entire world of this small gaggle of American elites who look as if they were all members of the same play on the same stage, the same little stage. And even if they disagree with each other, right? The implication was, here they all are, and you're not there. Cheers.
Yeah, more and more people are looking at exactly those images, Matt, that you describe, and I think simply ceasing to inhabit the imaginary world that they used to inhabit. I mean, it has been the kind of governing assumption of probably most of us for probably most of our lives that we live in a, strong, powerful, competent nation with a thriving representative government, the most thriving in the world, the strongest nation in the world. And every day that these images appear, every day that, people riot really anywhere in a political way, that image ceases to sort of carry weight, and which, as you and I talked about earlier on an episode of the Substack podcast that'll come out in a bit, that is a kind of a gateway to some form of solution. I mean, I think like one question on my mind is, will people look at these really dystopian images and say, that's America, or will they think something terrible has happened to America that is foreign to it? And now we have to find America, right?
I mean, we have to get out in the open before we talk about the words, which I think are worthy of looking at, worthy of analysis. But the imagery is very much, as many commentators have said, the obvious line is, if there was a coup in America, gosh, this is what it would look like when that president took office.
Right, of course. And yeah, for all the LARPing of sort of anti-fascist revolutionary rhetoric that's been the sort of bread and butter of the left for 4 years, the optics of this sure are chilling. And I think people, more than anything, at least people that sort of reach out to us when we hear from them, they are in a grieving process. They're like, and as P.G. Keenan, our contributing editor, has pointed out, like this just sort of completes an ongoing process of people coming to reckon with the fact that a lot of our assumptions are not true about the stability of the American regime, the functioning of it, and I think it's fair to say that we've been pretty realist about that on this show for a while, but
I respect the process. I mean, right. We've all, I think, already gone through this grieving process, and right. Some people are just going through it now, probably a lot of people, and you can't, until those dreams are shattered and until you've kind of already grieved for the loss of America as it was, right. You can't move forward. But I respect the fact that you're probably right. Like a lot of people are going through that now.
Yeah, and I mean, one task, it seems to me, that's kind of before us is to say that like that's accurate and true, but is not to be sort of interpreted as like the closing curtain so much as the starting bell, right? Like that's exactly the thing that people right now are tempted to see this stuff happen and think, well, that's it. It's like curtains for America. But the opposite is the case. Once you know what situation you're in, then you can actually get serious and gird your loins and think about what options are available to you in your immediate surroundings. Another thing you said to me on that episode that I thought was really right was like, you're not in control of a lot of this. A lot of it is like represents forces that are very primal in political philosophy that have to do with the way that like class conflict escalates in Republican regimes, and it's not actually your ability or responsibility to like shoulder that stone back into place at the top of its precarious mountain. Like it's your responsibility to think about like, well, okay, given that that's the scenario in which you live, what is your immediate what does the life around you look like, and how can you preserve what's good and beautiful and true in it, in such a way as to hopefully eventually reinstall that as the kind of dominant dynamic of American life. It's not as if we're despairing of the American project at all. Far from it. It's just that, like, you know, this is actually what restoring that experiment looks like right now, and that's a train that we've been on for a while, but for those who are on it, like getting on it just now, like welcome. You know, this is the thing that we must do is build infrastructure and institutions and communications channels that are resilient against authoritarian crackdowns and big tech and all the things that we've been talking about. Like it's a good moment for realizing like, oh yeah, we'd actually have to do that. Like that's in fact the whole fight.
There was a civil religion that was invoked during the day's strange and uncanny spectacle. And in some ways, it is presented as overlapping with America's founding civil religion. But in the particulars, in its essence, I think it is in fact much different. It is not even the civil religion that America is the greatest country on earth, right? And Barack Obama said, no, America is a country just like all the others. This is the civil religion that tells us that America is strong. And despite what was portrayed on the television, and despite the words which we can get into, we know that this civil religion is dead. We know that America right now is not strong, that this is not the United States of America that emerged from the Second World War, or emerged from the Cold War, or even emerged from 9/11 as the most powerful, the strongest country in the world. America is now weak. Our institutions are weak. Our people have been weakened. Our elites are weak. Our intelligence community is weakened. People know this. And when you watch the professional commentators take to Twitter or the news or whatever and say words that amount in so many words to, oh, America is strong again, stronger together, as Hillary Clinton would put it. That image is now visibly transparent and tattered and phony to Americans. They might stand up and cheer because hell, it's an inauguration and that's what you're supposed to do. But they know the truth that lurks behind that. And they know that what we're being sold as American strength is in fact not American strength. The institutions that are supposed to come save us, we know that they are not strong. We are being presented with a sort of simulacrum of America. And we're being told that it's just as strong as the America that came before. And you know what? Because there's now a token transsexual who's Assistant Secretary of Health, it's even stronger than it was before. And in America that has fake flags flying in the place of real crowds, that's even stronger than the America that came before. We know it's not true. And it's hard to stare in the face that reality. And it remains to be seen whether anyone associated with this incoming administration, many of whom are just warmed over Obama bots, are going to be capable of saying out loud what so many Americans know to be true, which is they're inheriting a crumbling regime. And it's not crumbling because of what Donald Trump did. Trump did a number of things, some of them effective, some of them ineffective. But the rot that started at the top and now reaches all the way down to the bottom levels of society is something that cannot be blamed on Donald Trump. And it cannot be blamed on Buffalo Boy or the Proud Boys or whoever it is that they want to dredge up and say, oh, insurrectionists. What happens when all the insurrectionists are in jail? What happens when all of the accounts that have said the wrong words or expressed the wrong feelings get canceled or deplatformed? What happens is people wake up every day and they realize that America is now weak. And if we don't have leaders who are willing and able to acknowledge that and take responsibility for that, it is going to be a very dark winter and a dark 4 years indeed.
I think, James, you're onto something when you identify like fakeness as a big part of that accusation. Like, you do not want to see these overblown parodies. You don't want to see these like big, flashy, glitzy travesties of the real thing. And this is basically, as James, you're indicating, like this is a confected inauguration. And one of my favorite commentaries on the speech was, I think it was Inez Stepman, who's written for us before. She goes, this is a great speech. Too bad none of us agrees on what the meaning of any of the words of it are. Right. And I thought that was about right. I mean, look, it's a speech that consists almost 100% of boilerplate. You could have copied and pasted it. I could have written it, like I could have predicted what was going to be in it. But in a funny way, you know, if you took it as a serious proposition, if you actually said, well, you know, here's a prognosis for where the country needs to go, well, then you would have to reckon with these lists of things that, you know, he asks for us to do and to seek. And he talks about, like, he gives a list of what we love as Americans. This was to me, this was the defining paragraph. He says, many centuries ago, St. Augustine, a saint in my church, that's disputed, but there we are, wrote to the people, this is a typo, but wrote that the people was...
Not that St. Augustine was Catholic, but rather that Joe Biden is a serious Catholic.
Right.
As soon as you mention that line, I have a big ice pick I have to pull out of my ear. This was the ultimate, It is a great place to go because it's...
Right.
It's cringe is much too shallow of a word.
Yeah, well, the emptiness of the, like, and this is something that drives me insane. It's a classic boomer move to trot out some figure of the great canon with no regard for the ways in which that figure's sort of passion and desires are totally in conflict with our modern regime, and just use him as a legitimating force, use his name, use the weight and gravity of his towering achievements to just represent totally unmerited and unearned clout on the part of the speaker. And that's precisely what this is, right? I mean, this in St. Augustine would be tearing his hair out to imagine like the way that we do politics. But this is, I suppose, I mean, it must be from City of God, this paraphrase. St. Augustine wrote, to the people, that the people was a multitude defined by the common objects of their love. This is a profound truth from Augustine, defined by the common objects of their love. What are the common objects we as Americans love that define us as Americans? Yes, indeed, Joe, that is exactly the question. I completely agree, right? I think we know. Now we have wandered into the territory of parody, right? Opportunity, security, liberty, dignity, respect, honor, and yes, the truth. Well, I would wager a guess that the majority of people, the majority of those 70 million plus, 74 plus million Americans who voted for Donald Trump are actually not thinking the same thing when they hear the word security that Joe Biden is thinking. Security of borders? Is that what's meant? No. Security of personal tradition, security of rights. No. I would imagine security from the eternal, all dominating specter of coronavirus. Security from those nasty white supremacists, namely all conservatives who would ever think to oppose the regime. And you could go on. I mean, liberty, dignity, right? These things don't have the same meaning for him that they have for us. They don't have the same meaning for half the country that they have for the other half of the country. And if you had to write a prescription for what would actually be a good project going forward, it would be to find some shared sense of what these words mean, right? If I even had for a moment believed that was on Joe Biden's mind, as opposed to just dictating the meaning of the words to us, but rather reaching out and saying, well, obviously we have to, look, these are good words. These are words to think about, right? I mean, it'd be good if faith was in there too, but like, there's no sense here that these words are in question.
And
right?
let's get real quick. Like, there's also, if we're going to go through the text, there's also reason to cast some doubt and suspicion on the equivocation going on in these words.
Right.
And I think one of the most remarkable lines of the speech, which you have to do a double take, given what we're going to talk about in the second half of this podcast with 1776, is when he says, "This is a great nation and we are a good people." I mean, that's shocking, right? I mean, that's the opposite of what we've heard from the left since forever. Yeah. Since always. Mm-hmm. This is a great nation and we are a good people. But all of a sudden you realize what he means by this. This is the moment when I think, people like, not, wild leftists, people like David Brooks and others are in tears. This is a great nation and we are good people. Thank God, yes, we are good people. We're not like Donald Trump, who used the wrong words. He used bad words and they were disunifying words, and these are the words we need. But Biden hints at something else here. This is a great nation and we are good people. But then you realize we have a winter of peril, right? A storm. We have much to repair, much to restore, much to heal, much to build, and much to gain. Okay, well, what are we talking about? Well, the virus. The business is closing because of the virus. I don't know who caused that, but anyway.
How did that happen?
A cry for racial justice. And the dream of justice for all will be deferred no longer. So, Martin Luther King notwithstanding, I mean, this is 400 years in the making. We realize there's a new cry for justice. And then, of course, the cry for survival from the planet. I don't know about that. But then the ultimate challenge, of all the ones he lists is this. And now a rise in political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat. And how will we overcome these challenges? It needs more than words, Biden admits. So here's what's more than words. We need unity. It's an elusive thing in a democracy, he says. We need unity to get rid of this domestic terrorism and this white supremacy that now stalks our lands and threatens the foundations of democracy. And I mean, if you're a listener to this podcast, you know exactly where that goes. But even within the text of its speech, there you have the moment, I think, where the game is up. And so then how is this a great nation and how are we a good people if we have this challenge of this domestic terrorism? Well, you're defining America as those who are on Joe Biden's side, right? I mean, for all the talk of unity, we need unity. What the speech really means is the good people won. We are the good people. We are America. And anyone outside of us is not.
What's funny also is few hours after that speech, or about 30 minutes ago, Trump, so used to saying that, Biden just released his latest EO, quote, on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. So specifically what he wants to do is, quote, embed equity principles, policies, and approaches across the federal government. This will include efforts to remove systemic barriers to and provide equal access to opportunities and benefits, identify communities the federal government is underserved, and develop policies designed to advance equity for those communities. So the words matter, and this EO is so vague that it's whatever the government designates as an underserved or community under attack is suddenly going to find new elevation. And people who have, in charge of, I guess, the power structure, I don't know what Biden and company plan to do with them. But so it's just fast on the heels of this kumbaya speech comes this kind of EO, which I didn't even have a chance to read the whole thing. I was just reading a line that jumped out. But we'll see more of it every day.
Yeah, it's one, it stands in contrast to the Trump administration's executive order about rooting out critical race theory, right, and stopping this sort of absurd practice of bringing in consultants to racially scapegoat white employees and encourage them to confess their privilege and all this sort of thing. That's where we get at the difference in the meaning of words. One that jumped out at me too was, and James mentioned my punchline in a way already, but I'll say it again. He says, Biden says politics need not be a raging fire destroying everything in its path. Every disagreement doesn't have to be a cause for total war. And we must reject a culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured. Says a man who just tapped a man who's now a woman to be his deputy secretary for Health and Human Services, and who we're all supposed to call a woman. I'm all for being polite to folks who, decide they're now women. You don't need to be gratuitous or rude. But the whole ideological apparatus behind that is dedicated to the manipulation of facts, especially biological facts, and the imposition of that manipulation on everyone in thought and deed. So we have to say that women shouldn't be called women in the context of childbirth. They should be called people with uteruses. We could roll out the litany of absurd manipulations of language that flow from all this, but there's this whole architecture behind Biden, ideologically and politically, that he has to surf atop and cannot direct, despite what he might want as conveyed in this speech. Biden's, he's a cipher. He knows how to go where the wind blows in his party, and his career has been one of evolution with his party. And I think there is the old boomer in Biden who really wants a lot of this and wants unity sort of in the moderate middle. But his party has moved on from that years and years ago, and its power centers won't let him toe that line. So,
how much agency do you think, Ryan, he has? How much agency are we ascribing to Biden right now? Like intellectual agency, the push behind some of these weird concepts.
No, I think he's mostly a product of the people around him. Look, he was a mediocre midwit even in his prime. Biden was never a towering genius or statesman. Not that you need to be a genius to be a good statesman, but he just has always been. People, what I really loved is in recent months and over the last year or so, people talking about even never Trumpers, talking about Biden's decency and, his honesty and everything. And this is a guy who had to scuttle his first presidential run because he plagiarized in law school and lied about his class position. I don't mean to, just cascade just Biden. Most of Washington is like this, mediocre and liars. But he's the cockroach of mediocre liars in a way. He's failed his way all the way up to the presidency. It's really remarkable. So, spare me this highfalutin rhetoric about his honesty and decency. And we'll all see, we're all going to see playing out in real time the disparity between the actions of this administration and the rhetorical posture from its head, putative head, Biden. Because, his instinct is to be the kind of moderate unifier, but his party is not interested in that, at least not its most vocal and energetic denizens.
This is the moral kitsch that is so stomach churning to sit in front of the TV and absorb or pick up on the Twitter thread. There is this theatrical vision of America at its best, which the sitting elite has run into the ground, and they don't want to give it up, but they acknowledge that it's out of gas, and so are they. And so their dream is for there to be a sort of organically arisen successor generation, a successor culture that they can hand the torch of America to. And sure, there will be many differences, but it'll still be the same America. And whatever's so great about America will be so transcendent and overarching, and it boils down to sentimentality, that it will be able to infuse the new America with the same spirit as the old. And yet you look around you, what would St. Augustine have to say about John Brennan? What would St. Augustine have to say about Kamala Harris? Venal, casually corrupt, comfortable corporatist. It's a long list, and I'm not going to just spend this time insulting people. But it's clear that Biden's purpose, if not to be the last straight white male president of the United States of America, which time will tell, but more importantly, to symbolize that this handoff is being made. And, Bill Clinton did this last time around. We're building a bridge to the 21st century, taking the generational torch away from George H.W. Bush's generation. The Democrats have tried to use this kind of vibe to their advantage before, but now, here we are, and it's still the same generation.
Yeah.
30 years later, on its last legs, invoking this, West Wing ethos, which was a copy of a copy of a copy in the 90s, and now is just an insult to those of us, millions upon millions of us, who can see the painful, brutal reality of what has become of our country and our people. And what we get is, well, the spirit lives on. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if the spirit lived on? What they want is peaceful regime change. And I do not have any confidence in their ability to carry the spirit of America over into a new era. I have lots of confidence in their ability to replace the current regime, which they've run into the ground with a new one. And that's what I expect will happen. And then I think that's what everyone expects is going to happen. And that's the subtext to this whole event is, behind Kamala's smile is the new America. And it's their way or the highway. That's the message that came across beyond all of the words of healing. And I think everyone's waiting for this other shoe to drop. How are they going to try to roll out this new revolution?
And we should say this is a long time Claremont point in a way. The way in which the progressives originally changed the Constitution, I mean, we haven't had the old republic in, well over a century, was similar. Woodrow Wilson and FDR particularly gave this lip service to the Constitution in the grand old way, but they didn't mean any of it. But they were conscious that continuity in the exact way you're suggesting was always needed. And the show had to go on. So FDR was really the master of this, like speaking in traditional language, but radically changing the nature of the American regime. And I think Obama's credit, as Charles Kessler has been one of the best people in the universe at pointing out, but to Obama's credit, he internalized this from the beginning. He knew that, he wanted to further the change, that bridge to the 21st century, but he would steep himself in kind of this really televisual vision of America, and what helped the whole thing move on since the World War II really is the way in which that they can play this boomer cartoon that James is describing, when in reality we all know, looking around, this is turning into a kind of dystopian nightmare. And if you think that that's overblown, go talk to someone who's 25 and looking for a job and it doesn't want to raise kids who are going to get their genitals mutilated in public schools. So this is not a joke, and it is. I think the hope is almost in what James is saying. It's the last vestiges, right? They have to go to someone older, not younger. They can't explicitly leave that fake kind of continuous story of America about progress that they've put forward. And so because they can't leave it, that public vision becomes more hollow and thinner by the day as more and more Americans are not just disenchanted, but angry. And what I can't get over is the imagery of the event today at the end of all the commentary is a bunch of people who are all on the same. It's very classist, right? A bunch of people who are all on the same side versus the rest of America who've been replaced by flags that are whispering in the wind. And there I think is the problem. This is going to break down. They are going to break the machine this time. I do not think we are going to get through the next 4 years or what's about to happen without them really breaking stuff. These idiots have been in charge for 30 years. Their technocracy sucks. They suck. As James says, there's no strong leaders. And now they're going to keep on pushing in radical, insane ways. And they're going to keep on pushing with the fantasy that covers it all up. But I mean, look at those images today, right? I mean, am I nuts? Like, you look at the images, it's like, wait a minute, America, blah, 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 and the peaceful transition of power in a militarized city where there's no citizens and only elites? This is insane. like even visually, it's done. Like those images are done. And I think the worry is that we have to be watchful and take action and move forward and build the things we need to build right now, because what they're doing is creating a radically unstable situation where the language everyone speaks, the fantasy they project, all of this has nothing to do with reality. That's a really dangerous place to be as a country.
Well, this is
I got to stop listening to this podcast, man.
It's too depressing.
This is what you get when you rip the guts out of a country and its people for over 25 years plus.
Yeah.
Deindustrialization, financialization, breaking up the families, crushing the civil society that arises out of religiously observant people. What you have is a collapse of industry, a collapse of enterprise. People spun out, atomized, drug addicted veterans from 20 years of failed wars. Of course, they're going to present a style of celebration that is rooted in symbolism. Obese people can smile on the cover of magazines. Single women can do synchronized dances on TikTok. This is amazing, you guys. A vice president can wear Chuck Taylors to the inauguration. It's incredible. This is a message of busy work, of, people blame the ideology. They say, oh, well, if it wasn't for cultural Marxism, we wouldn't be in this predicament. But why are these ideologies gaining the strength that they are? Why are they effective? And this is what happens in a people who have been demoralized in both meanings of that word. Americans have no savings. They have, in many cases, no future. They can barely make it through the present. They have broken families. They can't go to church, or they're disconnected from a church. They don't know their neighbors. They don't have a job. They're reliant on the government to put food in their mouth, to put food on the table. Their sons and daughters are doxing them on the internet.
Their educational system sucks.
Their educational system sucks, and they're not being produced for a life of freedom or equality. This is why equity is coming in, because even equality is now too threadbare of a myth for these people to hold together. But it's all happening because of what they've actually done to the country, to the people, to our habits and our mores that kept things going even in horrible times. And now we're going through, fairly bad times, challenging times, not the worst ever, not the worst we've seen. And yet we're struggling so badly. And what we're being offered is a Potemkin vision, a fantasy to climb into, to ride out the storm. Well, if everyone climbs into the fantasy box, no one's going to be there to mind the store. And that's what we're going through now. And again, we'll see how this plays out. It's possible that, over the next 4 years, some people will gain the wherewithal to address the situation, frankly, and with responsibility. But as for right now, we're just being offered more distractions.
How do we come back from that?
Well, we could discuss 1 year.
I don't know.
1 year of the American mind.
That's a good, yeah.
A little levity. We should know quickly. We don't have to spend too much time on it, but it bears on the theme that I mentioned and we've all been circling around, which is the disparity between rhetoric and action. Biden at one point in this speech talks about how he'll always defend the Constitution. And yet today he disbanded the 1776 Advisory Commission, which had just issued its report written by collaborated on by some friends of ours. Larry Arnn chaired that commission, a longtime vice chairman of the Claremont Institute, president of Hillsdale College, one of the founding members of the Claremont Institute. The executive director of it was Matthew Spalding, who was a Publius Fellow a couple decades ago, here at Claremont and runs the Washington, D.C. Center for Hillsdale under Larry's leadership. And they produced a very nice document, actually, which goes through the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and talks about the current challenges to America's principles and those that have faced us in the past, from slavery to progressivism to fascism to communism to racism and identity politics today. And then, what we need to do going forward, including some wonderful appendices on, the difference between equality properly understood and our modern identity politics, and religious liberty and faith and America's principles. We put an excerpt of it up on the website about the Declaration and the Constitution, and then we're going to do the religious liberty section tomorrow. But, the Biden administration disbanded it. The CNN headline about this, of course, it was issued on Monday on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, of course, and CNN's headline was Trump administration issues racist school curriculum report on MLK Day.
I mean, it's
well, but that's where we are, right? I mean, to advocate for colorblind constitutionalism, equality properly understood, and to rail against the racial case system that is our current identity politics, what cause du jour is to be racist, right?
it's
Yeah.
well, I mean, it's worth noting, I think, a couple things about this report and also the response to it, right? I mean, the 1619 Project, to which this is a direct response. I mean, this whole endeavor was conceived as a way of counteracting the genuinely corrosive force of this now thoroughly debunked, but nevertheless ubiquitously taught curriculum about how America began in 1619 when 28 or 30 slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. Right there. This is a thing that has been picked apart in highly specific ways by Marxists, by sort of liberal college professors writing in the pages of The Atlantic, by one of the fact checkers on the project itself. I mean, there is no shortage of documentation about how this is a lie, right? This is just a barefaced and thoroughly confected lie. It didn't matter. It got a Pulitzer Prize. The curriculum is installed in schools across the country at every level. And it was an object lesson, for me at least, in the irrelevancy of explaining, the irrelevancy of sort of going about the process of saying, well, actually, like, you got this wrong. They don't care. They're not about the truth. They're about propagandizing people and driving them at one another's throats. Hannah Jones has effectively, the author of the flagship essay, has effectively said as much. So I actually think, as things go, this is a much more effective mode of response, is to publish your own report. Trump commissioned it. It's of a piece with the sculpture garden that he asked for with American heroes, a sort of positive, but not reactive vision of the country that describes kind of what we believe about it and its greatness and its history. Perhaps predictably, the enemies of the traditional American regime came out with a slew of hit pieces that sort of aimed in this really fascinating way to sort of to recreate a facsimile of the organic reaction to the 1619 Project, which was widespread condemnation from both sides of the aisle. There's an effort being made to sort of portray the reaction of academics to this as something similar. The Washington Post, right? A hack job. Outright lies. Trump commissioned 1776 report. Outrageous historians. I just want to read one quote from that article and then meditate upon the difference between it and the reaction to the 1619 Project. It's very hard to find anything in here that stands as a historical claim or as the work of a historian. Almost everything in it is wrong, just as a matter of fact, said Eric Rauchway, a history professor at the University of California at Davis. This is the crucial part. I may sound a little incoherent when trying to speak of this because the report itself is not coherent. It's like historical whack-a-mole, right? Did you read a single fact? I mean, did I miss something? Was there a single fact in that statement? Like, was there a single specific objection to the vision of the country that's outlaid in the report, which is basically unobjectionable, certainly from a standpoint of facticity? There's nothing like the kind of corkers that come up in the 1619 Project, right? But all they have to do is wave their hands, right, and say magic words like racism, which occurs elsewhere in the article, and then say, well, if I sound like I have not a leg to stand upon, well, that's because these people are just so wrong that I can't even begin, to talk about it. And yeah, I mean, it's worth sort of pondering that and noting that this commission will go on, they've said on Twitter in a now, of course, unofficial capacity, even as their work is being zapped from the White House website. This obviously gets on their nerves. This obviously gets on the nerves of all the right people, and it's worth continuing.
We should drill into that, because I think if you're not sufficiently black-pilled and you're an academic, let's say, listening to this, of the older variety, you're sort of in BoomerCon land, you'll be knocked out of it by the reaction to the 1776 Commission.
Sure enough.
It's not just, Ida Bay Wells on Twitter saying, "Welp," and "ha-ha," Biden's getting rid of it. They're very happy. The 1619 gal herself, Nicole Hannah Jones, was very happy that Biden rescinds the commission and gloating about it. Kendi went off on the report, This was noticed by everybody. And what all you need to know is that the response is so vehemently negative, just screaming about how it is not scholarship, it is not history, it is racist. I mean, the response is visceral from really thousands of knowledge class elites as soon as it came out. And so they made a point of just going off about how this is laughable garbage. Yep. And also then saying, it's going to be disappeared, it's going to be memory hold by the Biden administration. And I think what it tells you is we're not in a situation where, I mean, the report matters for the sake of persuasion. The report matters because it signals to some people out there that there's still a coherent account of American history in which America isn't just simply an evil regime. It matters for some of those on the right who maybe believe that, but don't really have a leg to stand on in terms of arguing. But it's more of a marker than anything else. I mean, you're quite simply, this is not a situation in which you can send people a document about what America is and you persuade them. That is not going to happen. Their entire lives, they've been shaped by elites and institutions to think a certain way. And here's the clincher. The kind of account, whether you agree with it or not, that the 1776 report is not the kind of account that modern scholarship allows. You can't have these sorts of discussions without going into footnotes and going into, well, of course, I'm really smart because I understand the distinctions between this and that, and actually who can say blah, blah, blah. The only narratives that are going to survive are the ones that are going to serve the left, right? But even then, they couch them in ways that are I hate to use the word, but sort of postmodern. Like they couch them in, that's the wrong word, actually. It's a style, right, that scholarship has become. So real scholarship or narratives that are simple based on real scholarship are not allowed to fly anymore. We're not allowed to have those. So this is the kind of report that it triggers them. And it's a great thing that it triggers them. We should talk more about it. But it's not doing the kind of thing that modern scholarship does. Even outside of the problem of course, their narrative about America is even more simplistic, and this is counter to it. I hope that makes sense to some of you in the audience, because I think the mistake is to think, okay, well, we're gonna make an even longer 1776 report, and we're gonna argue even, and there's some value to continuing to fill in American history for those willing to listen, but we're long past when this would persuade anyone. This is a marker that triggers the hell out of the entirety of the American elite.
There's a reason why.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, Matt, you're right, because it's Spencer and I spoke about this on our Tell Me What You Really Think segment earlier, but it's already in the educational bloodstream, the version of American history that the erroneous version 1619 presents. Right? It's already in our public school system. Yeah, so you're right, Matt, that we're already behind the power curve on this. It's much worse than I think people understand.
There's a reason why, like, Hamlet became the sort of seminal work that it became, and I think it's because Shakespeare saw. I mean, and there's also a reason, by the way, why Hamlet has just come back from the University of Wittenberg, like before the whole thing begins. Like, Shakespeare saw that the more precisely and accurately you could parse the various different, qualifications on a basically true statement, the more paralyzed you would be in inaction and in self-loathing and the more frozen you would become. That is essentially the state, Matt, that you're describing, right?
Yeah, and let's talk about that, because right. I don't think let's talk more about why it doesn't matter, in a sense, like why everyone just viscerally reacts. Right. Because there are, like, as you guys are saying, there's 1,000 objections in the modern reader's mind to a report like this. There's 1,000 objections that are already set up from the time they were born to anything akin to what I think is a true narrative. And the problem is that in order to really understand, right, what what a true account of American history would be, you would need to spend years of studying and reading thousands of pages. It's like I tell our fellows. I mean, the people come in and they all think they know what America is. In order to really know that, you would have to read thousands of original pages of documents, right? You'd have to read lots of different historians and political scientists. And, it would take a lot of work over a long period of time to even begin to glimpse something of that picture. So in reality, like, no one's going to be able to fully decide for themselves. They're going to have to spend a long time, if you were an intellectual, thinking about these things and studying them. There are thousands and thousands of pages to read and get even a sense of just what a 10-year period in the 1770s looks like. I mean, you can't even read all of that in a lifetime. We haven't even published all the documents yet. So this is a problem. And what furthermore, so that's just if you really wanted to know yourself and do the research, right? But then beyond that, you have the problem of there are 1,000 obstacles in your head of people who have given counter narratives, right, to anything I would say sensible that other scholars have put up for over 100 years. And furthermore, America hasn't really cared in a long time to actually read the documents at all. So this is like a game you don't want to get trapped in, right? I mean, in order to really go back and forth, there's always an objection for the intellectual, right? The first stage of knowledge is realizing, oh my gosh, this is really complicated and all these people have these different opinions. You're just going to be stuck there forever in the contemporary context because they all know they're going to be against whatever's in this report. And they're going to bring a million different objections. And if you start going down the rabbit hole of answering them without owning institutions that can actually teach as a whole, it's just a losing battle.
I cannot say in strong enough terms what a betrayal this is and what a dereliction of duty this is on the part of our academics. I mean, you want to talk about elite failure. What you say, Matt, is of course perfectly true of any historical subject. Right. It is the minute you begin to embark upon a serious project of scholarship, you encounter a voluminous infinitude of complexity that you can't even begin to master.
Exactly.
And if you have any faith in yourself at all, or any, integrity in the project that you're undertaking, then you know that your job is to descend into those weeds and come out bearing something that resembles a simulacrum of the truth that you can offer to people so that they don't have to go do that work. Ben Sirach says that the scholar descends into the treasure house and sorts through everything and comes up with things for his time. He says, I am like the full moon. I reflect the light. That's the job. That's the job of the academic, right? And instead...
You go in and rummage in the treasure house and you pull out what's actually essential.
And instead, these fatuous eggheads, these miserable ass have used the complexities to which you allude, Matt, as a cudgel to stop people, to immobilize them in exactly Hamlet's dilemma, to make it impossible for them to say or think or believe anything about themselves that would give them the power to act.
And isn't that the problem too? Because it says, obviously there's people on the other side, so to speak, the people who have a narrative. Well, my narrative is it's much more complex than yours. It's that America was always intrinsically evil and bad and needs to be remade in the faddish image of watered down whatever that I espouse. Okay, great. That's fine. The problem is more that when you're talking about the people who consider themselves moderates, right, who also react to the 1776 Commission, the result of their work, the moderates are sitting there thinking like, well, the only way that I could really respond to anything like this narrative, and it's a narrative because they're all just stories, and the only way that I could respond to this is if I was the one who said, in a way, yes, and in a way, no. But even then, they've already lost the game. They're not actually neutral, right? They think that the only way, they think what scholarship is, right, is skewed in one direction. So there really is an epistemological problem here that runs very deep. And what I'm saying is not to say that at the end of the day, simplistic narratives are awesome and rule the roost. It's that even people who consider themselves moderates are going to be tilted against any kind of story that actually has some semblance of virtue in it. It's just not going to happen. I mean, wake up and smell the coffee. This ship has sailed. So do we need to promote this report and talk about it in the American mind? Absolutely. Do we need people to defend it? Absolutely. But outside of a different culture and educational system, we're trying to climb the waterfall.
Yeah, I just want to, it's instructive to quote a couple paragraphs from the New York Times negative write-up of this. This is them sort of talking to their right-thinking audience and saying, of course, anything that claims these sorts of things is obviously incorrect. So it being the 1776 report, portrays an America whose institutions have been infiltrated by leftist radicals, whose views echo those of recent totalitarian movements, and argues that progressives have created, in the so-called administrative state, an unchecked fourth branch or shadow government. And American universities, the report contends, are often today hotbeds of anti-Americanism, libel, and censorship that combine to generate in students and in the broader culture, at the very least, disdain and at worst, outright hatred for this country. Yeah, I think do you think the New York Times understands that at least 80 million Americans say, yeah, what's the problem with those two statements? I mean, those both seem demonstrably true to me.
This quote, what did they say? The so-called
administrative state. Yeah. So anyway, that gives you a flavor of the disdain for it.
Remember when the deep state, they said the deep state didn't exist, and then there was all hail the deep state. It's awesome.
Yeah. No, there's no deep state. What are you, a Turkish reactionary? And then it was, God bless the deep state. Even Bill Kristol, right? If I have to choose between the Trump state and the deep state, I'll take the deep state.
Hey.
I've been told we're out of time. We'll have to reprise the first 365 days or so, or the first year of the American Mind at the next episode, which is good, actually. None of us really had time to go relook at all this stuff. I sort of did a cook's tour of it, and I will remind everyone, which everyone knows, our first episode we started by talking about Jeffrey Epstein. It seems like
so long ago,
a political millennium ago.
And I stand by everything we said.
Oh yeah, no, it's been validated by history and events.
Well, especially that he didn't kill himself.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, he did not. For people listening, a year has not changed the fact that Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewbooks.com. Don't forget to rate us well. Review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, as always, to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. Thank y'all. Talk to you next week.